Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. For the last few weeks, I've been reading contemporary works on 19th century American authors. One book was a traditional biography, one a biography in the trendy contemporary style of focusing on a handful of pivotal moments in the subject's life, and one a fascinating and also trendy cross between a memoir, a biography, and a literary analysis of the author's poetry. Interestingly, all three of the 19th century authors seem to have something to say to our contemporary world, a world wrapped up in the theme of isolation and the need for connection. Those authors are Emily Dickinson, a poet who wrote almost secretly and seldom left her house or even her room; Henry David Thoreau, who lived alone in a simple cabin by Walden Pond for 2 years; and perhaps perversely, Walt Whitman, perhaps the greatest urban poet who, quote, democratized poetry, partly because of his deep embrace of the bustling humanity around him in New York. Let me give you just a little bit of background about my own connection to these specific writers. First, Dickinson and Whitman. In 2012, my homeschool son was starting the 8th grade. He was a budding musician, a fencer, and a reader for sure. He was fascinated by everything from science to theater. My spouse and I wondered what direction he might take in the future. Would he lean toward science and math and social science, as my spouse did? Would he lean towards the humanities, as I did? Although I did not know I would until I was in college. Well, back in the fall of 2012, when my budding teenager was starting to sleep a little later in the morning than I was, Coursera and edX and other organizations were really coming on the scene with massive open online courses, MOOCs, for people to watch at home, do some sort of assignment, and evaluate the assignments of other students, etc. Although a lot of those early courses were computer science-based or math, I was drawn to one of the earliest humanities classes, a literature class on modern American poetry called ModPo. Phil Rice and some of his students put together an absolutely amazing class, which attracted an absolutely amazing global community of learners, a community that's really continued and grown for almost 8 years now. Anyway, I was just starting to watch the videos, halfway through the second short video in week 1, when my son woke up and came downstairs. He joined me on the couch as I finished the last couple of minutes of the video. I started to turn off my computer so we could do whatever else we had planned for that day, and he stopped me. He was absolutely entranced, and by the end of the course, a couple of months later, he was pretty sure he would become a lit kid. A future English major, maybe. Fast forward to today, when he is currently downstairs in my old study, putting the finishing touches on his junior paper, a long research paper required for his major, English. Well, that first week of the ModPo course introduced the work of 2 poets and set them up as examples of 2 very different, yet very American styles. One was Emily Dickinson, master of the careful, contained, and intense poem. The other was Walt Whitman, master of the unrestrained, embracing, extravagant poem. And for the rest of the term, we often flashed back and asked, in what ways is this poet responding to Dickinson's style or to Whitman's style? I'm oversimplifying the nuance with which Phil Rice and his students and guests approach these questions. But for all the years since, I've used Dickinson to represent introversion and Whitman to represent extroversion in literature and in broader life. So it feels really appropriate to be talking about these 2 authors in 2 newly published works this week. The first is Martha Ackmann's These Fevered Days, 10 Pivotal Moments in the Making of Emily Dickinson. In one of my favorite Dickinson poems, the author writes, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. suggesting the straightforward narrative isn't necessarily the one always best received, and possibly not the narrative most likely to actually convey the truth. In these fevered days, Ackmann follows Dickinson's advice. Her new biography of the 19th century American poet is built around 10 distinct moments from Dickinson's life. These episodes, which really are shaped more by particular lines from Dickinson's correspondence than they are around particularly meaningful times in the poet's life, include discussions of Emily's deep connection to language and imagery, her consideration of religion, her relationships with other writers and editors, and the role of grief at the end of her life. My favorite section in Ackmann's book describes how Dickinson preserved her work. Ackmann surmises that, quote, when Emily surveyed the sea of papers around her, she knew she needed a better system of preserving her poems. Dickinson, according to her biographer, decided that if she wanted to be distinguished, she would have to do so on her own terms, given the limitations placed on women in mid-19th century America. The poet carefully copied her poems onto cream-colored stationery and sewed the sets of sheets together with a needle and fine string, creating handwritten booklets, later called fascicles. These books have become the definitive source for literary scholars who want to use Dickinson's atypical style of capitalization and punctuation when they publish new editions of her work. For many years, Ackmann taught a college course about Dickinson, one which met in a seminar room at the Emily Dickinson Museum in the poet's hometown of Amherst, Massachusetts. Her research for those classes and for this book included not only a review of her personal correspondence and local newspapers, but also visits to places important to the poet. Ackmann trod the path between Dickinson's home and her brother's house next door. She recited Shakespeare in the attic, just as Emily did, and she even wrote sections of her biography at the desk where Dickinson herself had worked. Her engagement in Dickinson's physical reality is echoed by the book's lovely cover design, a reference to the wallpaper in Emily's bedroom. In my opinion, the greatest strength of these fevered days is Ackmann's ability to convey with tangible immediacy the physical world of Amherst. I was totally drawn into the book, partly because of the strong sense of place. But this immediacy comes with its own set of problems. Frequently, Ackmann's interpretations are based less on written source material than on her belief that she can channel Emily's spirit through her immersion in Dickinson's world. She often writes as if she knows what the poet was thinking, based not on her academic research, but on her own knowledge of physical layout or on historical record of a particular day's weather. For example, Ackmann writes that, quote, as the poet raised her eyes above the hemlock hedge, Emily watched, but this time she also waited. How does Ackmann know that Dickinson raised her eyes or watched anything? She provides no citation. Sometimes her imaginings are not just atmospheric, but instead deal with important literary concerns. For example, Ackmann states without equivocation that Emily Dickinson, quote, wanted fame. The only question was how to achieve it. Later, Ackmann acknowledges evidence to the contrary. Dickinson not only kept her poems almost completely private, but also left explicit word that all her writing should be burned following her death. Even when the biographer does provide citations, when I went to the endnotes to look up what the evidence was, I was stymied. The letters are cited only by number, with no reference to who wrote them or who the intended recipient was. In addition to the author's tendency to state her imaginings as if they were truth, Ackmann chooses not to engage with some of the debates in the Dickinson scholarship. For example, although These Fevered Days does mention Dickinson's sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert, the author chooses not to discuss the close friendship between the two women. Using textual evidence, several current scholars have argued that their relationship was not only close but romantic, and perhaps even sexual. I promise I'll talk more about this in some future video. One of my acquaintances is the scholar who is most known for this line of reasoning, and that scholar was a major consultant on one of the new films about Emily Dickinson's life. Anyway, Ackmann doesn't just ignore the issue of potential romantic or sexual relationship between Emily and Susan. She makes a choice to minimize their entire friendship. At the same time, but at the other extreme, Ackmann interprets Dickinson's late-life correspondence with her father's old friend Otis Judge as obviously romantic, although many contemporary scholars are a bit more circumspect. Quote, "After Emily pledged her love, Otis Lord asked her to marry him, or seemed to," writes Ackmann. Emily's pledge of love is clearly sincere. At least to me, it's not at all clearly romantic. At least no more clearly romantic than her letters to many other men and women. Nor is marriage the only way to interpret the proposal Otis Lord apparently made. So, despite Ackmann's intensely readable prose, if you're a serious reader of Dickinson, or of biography in general, you might be disappointed by Ackmann's reluctance to accept both the complexity of scholarship and the limitations of extant evidence. Or perhaps you'll be impressed by her psychic powers. Reading a book about Dickinson at a time when the whole world has been asked to live some way akin to her solitude is interesting. If she were alive today, would she even notice the difference between the way we need to shelter at home and the way she sheltered at home? For her, connection to the larger world came through words. The zillion letters she wrote to cultivate friendships with others, early Zoom, I guess. And, of course, the zillions of poems she wrote, and possibly some of the letters that she wrote, the ones addressed to who knows who, which she constructed as she communed with all that was happening in her own head. All right. Another book I read this month was Mark Doty's What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life. Doty's writing is just as lyrical as Whitman's writing, and this book is really lovely, even when it crosses some borders that I thought might make me a little uncomfortable. More on that in a minute. Let's start with Whitman, though. He is a totally different kind of poet from Dickinson, expansive and embracing, as I think I said earlier. Walt Whitman wrote in his poem, "To You, whoever you are, now I place my hand upon you, that you be my poem." Is Whitman addressing a stranger he walks by in the streets of New York, a stranger he immediately recognizes as a representation of the whole of humanity? Or perhaps he's addressing us, his readers. "I have loved many women and men, but I love none better than you," he continues. Doty takes Whitman's words seriously and personally. What is the Grass is a combination of biography of Whitman, literary analysis of Whitman's poetry, and an intimate exploration of Doty's own life. He poses 5 sources of Whitman's timeless power as a poet. The first source is perhaps most difficult to grasp, and Doty's argument left me unsure of what he meant exactly. A mystical experience, a peak experience, a blurring or merge between self and other, a liberation from the limits of space and time, he writes as he attempts to explain. Whatever it was, this experience allowed Whitman to write active, immediate poems that give us a, quote, remarkably intimate relationship with the interiority of another, as Doty says. He explains that the title of Whitman's Leaves of Grass might specifically be referring to the kind of dynamic and unmediated response. Before they printed books, to test the look or setting of type, printers produced practice pages, or leaves, filled with, quote, bits of nonsense, trial runs, nothing to be taken too seriously. That is, words, quote, springing into being everywhere. His poems embody that same kind of experimental and personal spirit. The second source of Whitman's genius is his fascination with the physical body. especially the masculine body. Despite the fact that a few scholars, and Whitman himself, have denied that the poet felt sexual desire for other men, Doty insists otherwise. Quote, "They are wrong, and he was lying." Doty's exploration of the history of sexuality makes it clear why queerness often remained unseen in literature until fairly recently. He then shows that Whitman, quote, "infuses his descriptions of men's bodies with such palpable longing that anyone sympathetic to such desires cannot miss his intent." This section is the longest one in the book, and here Doty extensively explores not only Whitman's writings about masculine physicality and same-sex love, but his own personal experiences as he first came out as a gay man, then as the AIDS epidemic tore through the community, and finally as queer culture became more visible and more accepted throughout American society. And it is this section that both moved me deeply and pushed my comfort level a bit. Doty is more explicit about his sexual experiences, both details about physical interactions and accounts of how and where such encounters took place, than I usually read. I found myself too shy to actually post an answer to the Sex and Literature tag Brian posted a while back on his channel Bookish, and this chapter definitely made me blush too. Nevertheless, a lot of the chapter is really beautiful. Throughout Doty's life, his literary relationship with Whitman is that of reader, but also that of student, lover, and finally mirror. Another inspiration for the poetry of Walt Whitman was the bustling city that surrounded him. As the poet walked the streets of New York, he saw the great diversity of America's growing population, of all social classes and kinds of employment, from artists, blue-collar workers, farmers, and traders to slaves, soldiers, and prostitutes. These Americans were from a diversity of backgrounds as well. Among others, they were male and female immigrants from across the globe, American Indians, African Americans, people with disabilities. The vastness of the city encouraged the development of a democratic spirit in Whitman's poetry, that spirit of embracing and celebrating multiplicity and expansiveness within the city and within the self. Doty calls Whitman a, quote, note-keeper of the urban soul. Living in the metropolis also meant that Whitman was exposed to a changing oral language, the colloquial speech rapidly developing in urban areas of the United States at this period. Doty compares Whitman's words to, quote, the lexicon of Chaucer or Shakespeare, poets who also heard in their own times their language renewed. He argues that the sound of spoken American English infused Whitman's poetry with a freshness, as well as with a stance towards experience and the world. The poet turned what had been seen as unpoetic language into the language of modern American literature. Whitman's final source is his awareness of death. During his life, Whitman insisted that he was a poet of the body, but Doty points out that the only kind of body that has remained is his body of work. Whitman wrote that after he died and was buried in the ground, we would find him in the dirt under our boot soles and in the grass growing anew from that dirt. And we find him in the pages of Leaves of Grass, still speaking to us. Doty recognizes and helps us see how much the poet is still part of the world of the living. At the end of the book, he asks with deep thoughtfulness, have I looked back to Whitman because he has all my life, though I did not know it, looked forward to me? In this world of global pandemic, I suspect Walt Whitman would have really struggled. I'm thinking of the meme that's been going around about how introverts need to be checking on their extrovert friends. Dickinson totally needs to be writing some notes to Walt, maybe Thoreau too, which we'll get to in my next video. I suspect Whitman shook hands and hugged and breathed all over everyone he met, even reaching out, as Doty says, for those of us who came long after he died, even for those of us who haven't yet been born. I'm so glad to have both Dickinson and Whitman to keep me company right now. I was thrilled to have the chance to review both the Dickinson book and the Whitman book for Open Letters Review, an online journal put together by Booktubers' own Steve Donahue and some fellow reviewers and editors. If you haven't checked out Open Letters, I strongly encourage you to take a look. There are a ton of great reviews, some written by Steve, but also many written by other reviewers, including a fair number of booktubers. There's a brand new app for Open Letters Review too, available for iPhone and Android, and it's beautiful. I'll link to my reviews for these particular books below, down in the description box. I'll be back in an upcoming video to talk about Isolation and Connection Part 2, focusing on a relatively recent biography of Henry David Thoreau, as well as a few other writers and thinkers who've thought about Thoreau's work. Thanks so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.